Let's now have a look at the triggers. Triggers which will allow us to submit, reset, or clear our form from anywhere within our page structure. They don't have to be within the form wrapper tag. So under the components, we're going to create a new directory, call it triggers. And here we're going to start with a new view file called trigger.view. And from within this file, we're going to start with a template. Template will contain span with the class associated with the CSS class computed property we'll create in just a moment, and then vhtml, what we want this span to contain between the opening and closing span tags will be coming from the computed property as well, called label. Then on click, we would like to call trigger method. None of these elements currently exist, so let's quickly add script section. And again, export default and object literal. Let's start with computed properties. And let's create the CSS class. First of all, just method stubs for the time being, then label. And then after this, we're going to create methods section with our trigger. And trigger will just log to the console, so console log the message, please implement trigger method. And this is because this will be the base class, which will be then used as a mixin for all types of triggers that we're going to have. Okay, so this is the basic structure. Now, before computed properties, we are going to add our mixins. So mixins, and for the mixins, we only going to have disabler. So let's import it as well. Import disabler from, and it's coming 2 levels up to the mixins and disabler. After that, we will have a few properties, so props, and we are going to have group first of all, which will be of the type string and required set to true. Then we will have is submit, which will represent the flag indicating whether the given trigger should submit the form, or is it a reset perhaps. So clear, if it's a submit, there will be a slightly different behavior, and it will be of the type boolean, and default will be set to false. So by default, it will not be a submit trigger. Then we're going to have a name. Name will be used with the checkboxes when we submit a number of items, but as we are working on it, let's just add it straight away as well. So name, a type will be string, and default value will be items. Then after the name, we're going to have resting label. Resting label is going to be the label associated with the button when the button hasn't been clicked, when it's not processing any requests. So resting will be type string as well, and default value will be simply submit. Then we are going to have a resting CSS class, any styling that we want to apply to our trigger, type string, and it will be an optional item, so required set to false. After resting CSS class, we're going to have resting icon, because we're going to be using font awesome here. If you're using anything else, you can also specify this via this property. So resting icon will be type of the string and required also false, because it's going to be an optional property. Then we have working label, working CSS class, and working icon. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate all these 3 items and just change resting to working. So working label, CSS class, and icon. And rather than submitting, submit for this working label, it's going to be processing as default, and again, working CSS class and working icon will be optional properties. The next thing we're going to add is the data method, which will return an object again with one property called processing set to false by default. Now let's have a look at our computed properties. We're going to start with the CSS class. First of all, we're going to check if this processing And if it's processing, then we are going to return an array. And from within this array, we are going to first check this working class, CSS class. If it's specified, then use it. So this working CSS class. Otherwise, use the resting one. Resting CSS class, and also disabled. Because when the action associated with a given trigger is being processed, we want this button to be disabled. Okay, so that's if it's processing. Otherwise, we return again array, this resting CSS class, and then we are going to use disabled class only if this is disabled is set to true. And this obviously comes from our disabler. Okay, so these are two possible scenarios. When it's processing, we're returning this, otherwise we're going to return that. Now for the label, we're going to have a similar situation. So again, if this processing, then we are going to return, and within the brackets I'm going to use this working icon. We're going to check if it's available, and if it's available, we're going to use I tag with the class associated with this and concatenation this working icon property, then concatenating with the closing opening I and closing I tag. And otherwise, we are just going to return an empty string. And that's going to be concatenated with this working label. So we're going to have an icon and a label when it's processing. Otherwise, we are going to use pretty much the same thing. The only thing is we are going to change, rather than working, it's going to be resting. So if we have resting icon, add it, prepend it to our resting label. Now we should actually add a space after this icon as well, so it's not right next to the label. There's one space basically in between. Okay, and after our computed properties, before our methods, let's add the created method, and from here we are going to register two listeners, event pass listen, to disable started, and then concatenating this with this group. And if that happens, then what we want to do, we want to call disable methods, and the same for enable. So when disable ended this time, we want to enable button back. So that's our trigger view file completed. In the next video, we'll have a look at the form trigger, which will act as a button for submitting the form, for resetting it, as well as clearing the input.